The sound of breathing outside my tent wasn't human. I knew that much for certain. I'd been coming to these woods for years, but never had I felt so alone, so vulnerable. The vast wilderness of northern Minnesota had always been a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of city life and lose myself in the primal rhythms of nature. But tonight, as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, ears straining to catch every whisper of sound, I realized how thin the barrier between predator and prey truly was. It started as a typical November hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work, packed my gear, and driven the 5 hours from Minneapolis to the Chippewa National Forest. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth greeted me as I shouldered my pack and hiked deep into the backcountry. I'd always preferred solitude when hunting. There was something pure about facing nature on its own terms, relying solely on my own skills and instincts. No cell phone signal, no GPS, just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I saw plenty of sign, deer tracks, droppings, places where bucks had scraped the bark from saplings, but no clear shot presented itself. That was fine by me. The quiet observation, the patient stalking, was as much a part of the experience as the kill itself. On the third evening, I made camp in a small clearing nestled between two ridges. It was a good spot, sheltered from the wind with a clear view of a game trail about 50 yards away. I set up my small one-man tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. I huddled close to my small campfire, savoring a meal of beef jerky and instant coffee as I listened to the forest settle into its nocturnal rhythms. An owl hooted in the distance. Wind whispered through the bare branches overhead. It was peaceful, serene, everything I'd come out here for. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake, unsure of what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the clearing. I blinked, disoriented, trying to pinpoint what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, followed by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Something was moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. My first thought was deer. I'd chosen this spot hoping to catch an early morning buck heading to water. But as I strained my eyes against the darkness, doubt crept in. The movement seemed too deliberate, too purposeful for a deer. I reached for my flashlight, hesitating for a moment before flicking it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing nothing but shadows and tangled vegetation. Whatever had made the noise was hidden from view. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone there?" No response, just the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself I was being paranoid, probably just a raccoon or fox prowling around the edges of my camp, drawn by the scent of food. Still, a nameless unease had taken root, and I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. I stoked the fire, adding a few logs to build it back up. The flare of light pushed back the darkness, and with it, some of my apprehension. I was a grown man, for crying out loud, an experienced outdoorsman. I wasn't about to let some bumps in the night spook me like a kid at summer camp. Settling back onto my bedroll, I tried to relax. The fire crackled companionably. The familiar weight of my rifle lay within easy reach. There was nothing to worry about. That's when I heard the footsteps, clear, distinct, and unmistakably bipedal. They were slowly circling the perimeter of my camp, just beyond the firelight's reach. I sat bolt upright, heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I shouted, snatching up my rifle. "I'm Adam. Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, a low growl rumbled from the darkness, a sound that sent ice water flooding through my veins. Bear. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd encountered black bears before, of course. They were common enough in these woods, but they were usually shy, quick to avoid human contact. This one's behavior was all wrong. It was too bold, too aggressive, Keeping my movements slow and deliberate, I stood and backed toward my tent. I needed to get to my bear spray. The rifle was for deer, loaded with ammo that would only piss off a bear this size. I never made it to the tent. A massive shape burst from the underbrush, moving with shocking speed for something so large. In the firelight, I caught a glimpse of shaggy fur, glinting teeth, and eyes that reflected an eerie, intelligent malevolence. I brought the rifle up instinctively, squeezing off a shot that echoed like thunder through the quiet forest. The bear roared, in pain or rage, I couldn't tell. And then it was on me. 500 pounds of fur, muscle, and fury slammed into my chest, driving the air from my lungs. I hit the ground hard, the rifle spinning from my grasp. Razor-sharp claws raked across my thigh, and I screamed in agony. Dimly, I was aware that I should play dead. Every wilderness guide, every nature documentary I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. But in that moment, with hot breath on my face and death staring me in the eyes, instinct took over. I thrashed wildly, kicking and punching for all I was worth. My hand closed around a burning log from the fire, and I swung it desperately at the bear's face. There was a satisfying sizzle and yelp as the embers connected. The weight on my chest lessened for a split second, just enough for me to roll sideways and scramble toward the tent. I dove through the flap, fumbling frantically for the bear spray I'd stupidly left inside. Behind me, I heard the bear recovering, its enraged bellows growing closer. My fingers closed around the canister, just as claws shredded through the tent's thin nylon walls. I spun, depressing the trigger and sending a cloud of capsaicin spray directly into the bear's snarling face. The effect was instantaneous. It reared back with a roar of pain, pawing at its eyes and snout. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I burst out of the shredded tent and ran. Pain lanced through my injured leg with every step, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I had no plan, no destination in mind. I just knew I had to put distance between myself and the enraged animal behind me. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches whipping past my face. I stumbled over roots, crashed through underbrush, gasping for breath as I pushed myself to keep moving. Every snapping twig sounded like pursuit. Every shadow held the promise of gleaming teeth and slashing claws. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that panic flight. Eventually, my leg gave out, and I collapsed against the trunk of a massive oak. I huddled there, shivering, straining my ears for any sign of the bear. Nothing, just the quiet sounds of the forest at night. As the adrenaline faded, the pain in my leg flared to life with a vengeance. I fumbled with shaking hands to examine the wound. It was bad. Deep gashes that were still oozing blood, but not immediately life-threatening. I tore strips from my shirt to bind the injury as best I could. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I had no idea where I was. No se place. No guipon. And somewhere out in the darkness was a wounded, angry bear that had already demonstrated its willingness to attack humans. Dawn was still hours away. I knew I couldn't stay put. Exposure would become a real threat as the temperature continued to drop. But moving risked drawing attention, either from the bear or other predators attracted by the scent of blood. In the end, the decision was made for me. A distant roar echoed through the trees, farther away than before, but still too close for comfort. It was looking for me. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pulled myself to my feet. I oriented myself using the North Star and began limping in what I hoped was the direction of the logging road where I'd left my truck. It would be a long, grueling journey through the night. As I moved, my mind kept returning to the bear's eyes in those terrifying moments by the campfire. There had been something unnatural there, something that went beyond simple animal hunger or territorial aggression. It was as if some malevolent intelligence had been looking out at me from behind those bestial features. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just fear and shock playing tricks on me. Bears were dangerous predators, but they weren't monsters. They didn't stalk humans with deliberate purpose. Did they? A twig snapped in the darkness behind me. I froze, heart racing, ears straining to catch the slightest sound. Nothing. After a long moment, I resumed my slow, painful trek through the wilderness. But with every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. The night stretched endlessly before me, full of shadows and unseen dangers. And somewhere out there in the darkness, something waited. This hunt was far from over. The compass needle spun wildly, mocking our growing panic. Lost in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, we were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey. I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle, but nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded in the Alaskan backcountry. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. 2 weeks of pristine wilderness, majestic wildlife, and the chance to bag a trophy moose. Instead, it became a desperate fight for survival against nature at its most unforgiving. My buddy Jake and I had been planning this trip for years. We'd saved up, trained hard, and invested in top-of-the-line gear. We thought we were ready for anything the last frontier could throw at us. How wrong we were. The first few days were everything we'd dreamed of. We flew into a remote area of the Kenai Peninsula, setting up our base camp near a picturesque alpine lake. The autumn colors were in full glory, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. We spotted more game in those first days than I'd seen in years of hunting back home in Montana. On our 4th day out, we decided to push deeper into the surrounding mountains. We'd seen promising signs of moose activity and wanted to investigate further. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just a hint of winter in the air. We packed enough supplies for an overnight trip and set out at first light. The hiking was tough but exhilarating. We climbed steadily through dense spruce forests that gradually gave way to open tundra. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached a high ridge that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. Miles of untouched land stretched in every direction, not a sign of human presence anywhere. "Man, this is what it's all about," Jake said, grinning as he surveyed the landscape. "Makes you feel pretty small, doesn't it?" I nodded, taking a long pull from my water bottle. "Sure does. Hey, check it out, 3 o'clock, about 500 yards out." Jake followed my gaze, raising his binoculars. Well, I'll be damned. That's a bull if I ever saw one. Through my own optics, I could make out the massive form of a bull moose grazing in a meadow below us. Even at this distance, the rack was impressive, easily a 60-incher. "What do you think?" I asked. "Worth going after?" Jake considered for a moment. "It'll put us further out than we planned, and it's getting late. But hell, that's why we came all this way, right?" I couldn't argue with that logic. We decided to make our way down to a sheltered valley about a mile from where we'd spotted the moose. We'd set up camp there for the night and try to stalk it at first light. That's when things started to go wrong. As we descended from the ridge, a bank of clouds rolled in with startling speed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. The temperature plummeted and a biting wind picked up, driving stinging sleet into our faces. "Nasty squall," Jake shouted over the wind. "Let's find some cover and wait it out." We huddled beneath an overhanging rock, watching as the storm intensified. What had started as a brief shower quickly turned into a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled, drowning out all other sounds and whipping snow into impenetrable white curtains. An hour passed, then 2. As darkness began to fall, we realized we had a serious problem on our hands. "We need to get to lower ground," I said, teeth chattering. "Find some real shelter before we freeze our asses off." Jake nodded grimly. He pulled out his compass, and that's when the bottom really dropped out of our world. The needle swung erratically, refusing to settle on any fixed direction. Jake frowned, tapping the casing. What the hell? This thing was working fine earlier. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature settled in my gut. Without a working compass, and with zero visibility in the storm, we were well and truly lost. "Okay, don't panic," I said, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. We know the general direction we came from. If we head downhill, we're bound to hit the tree eventually. We can hole up there until this blows over. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We gathered our gear and set out into the maelstrom. The next few hours were a blur of stumbling through knee-deep snow, fighting against wind that threatened to knock us off our feet. Every landmark was obliterated by the storm. We could have been walking in circles for all we knew. Finally, mercifully, we began to see the dark shapes of trees looming out of the whiteness. We'd reached the tree-line, but any sense of relief was short-lived. In the gathering gloom, the forest took on a menacing aspect. Branches clawed at us like grasping fingers. Shadows seemed to move with purpose just beyond the limit of our vision. We managed to find a relatively sheltered spot beneath a cluster of large spruces. Exhausted and half-frozen, we hurriedly set up our tent, fumbling with numb fingers. As we huddled in our sleeping bags, trying to warm up, an unnatural silence fell. The howling of the wind died away, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed in on us from all sides. "You hear that?" Jake whispered. I strained my ears, not sure what he meant. Then I heard it, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. It was answered by another, closer this time. "Wolves." I breathed. We'd known there were wolves in the area, of course, but they generally avoided humans. These didn't sound like they were avoiding anything. "They're hunting," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "The storm probably has them desperate for food." Another howl split the night, so close it might have been just outside our tent. I reached for my rifle, making sure it was within easy reach. "We need to get a fire going," I said. "It's our best chance to keep them at bay." Jake nodded, already reaching for his pack. We had some emergency fire starters, but with everything soaking wet from the storm, getting a blaze going would be a challenge. We worked feverishly, gathering what dry tinder we could find and shaving off curls of bark from the inner layers of fallen branches. All the while, the howls grew closer, more insistent. I could almost imagine I heard the soft pad of paws circling our campsite. After what seemed like an eternity, we managed to coax a small flame to life. We fed it carefully, gradually building it up until we had a respectable fire crackling in front of our tent. The warmth was a blessing, but the light cast writhing shadows among the trees. Every flicker of movement sent my heart racing. Were those gleaming eyes watching us from the darkness, or just my imagination running wild? "We should take turns keeping watch," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like our chances if we both fall asleep." I agreed, though the thought of facing the long night alone was terrifying. We decided I'd take first watch while Jake tried to get some rest. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The wolves' howls had stopped, but that was almost worse. Now every snapping twig or rustle of branches had me jerking my head around, searching for threats in the impenetrable gloom beyond our firelight. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl, too deep to be a wolf. There was only one animal it could be. "Jake," I hissed, shaking him awake. "We've got company, the big kind." He was instantly alert, hand going to his rifle. "Where?" I gestured towards the sound. "Can't see it, but it's close. Real close." We sat in tense silence, straining our eyes against the darkness. Then we saw it, a massive shape moving through the trees. In the flickering firelight, I caught glimpses of shaggy brown fur and a hulking, humped shoulder. It was a grizzly bear, and it was heading straight for our camp. "Oh shit," Jake breathed. "What do we do?" My mind raced through our options, none of them good. Our tent offered zero protection against a determined grizzly. We could try to scare it off with noise in our fire, but if it was hungry enough, that might just provoke an attack. Our rifles were a last resort. Even a well-placed shot might not stop a charging bear in time. The grizzly paused at the edge of our firelight, raising its head to sniff the air. I could see steam rising from its nostrils in the cold air. It was close enough that I could make out the curve of its claws, each one longer than my fingers. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked directly at us. I met its gaze and saw something there that defied description, a cold, alien intelligence that seemed to weigh and measure us. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and melted back into the forest. Jake let out a shaky breath. Holy shit, that was too close. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The encounter left me rattled in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just fear, although there was plenty of that. It was a bone-deep certainty that we didn't belong here, that we were trespassers in a world that cared nothing for our presence. The rest of the night passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. Every shadow held a potential threat. The forest itself seemed to be closing in around us, branches reaching out like grasping hands. When dawn finally broke, it brought little relief. The storm had passed, but a thick fog had settled over the landscape, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards in any direction. Our compass was still malfunctioning, the needle spinning uselessly. We broke camp quickly, eager to be on the move. We had to find our way back to base camp before our limited supplies ran out. But as we shouldered our packs and looked out at the featureless white void surrounding us, a grim realization set in. We were well and truly lost, in a wilderness that seemed determined to keep us that way. And somewhere out there, unseen but ever-present, the true denizens of this harsh land were watching, waiting. Our hunt had become something else entirely, a desperate race for survival against opponents that knew these woods far better than we ever could. As we set out into the mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, that every step we took was leading us exactly where something else wanted us to go. The Alaskan wilderness had claimed many lives before. I was determined that we wouldn't be adding our names to that list. But as another distant howl echoed through the fog, I realized the true challenge was only beginning. The cabin door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness within. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never should have opened that journal. I've been hunting these Virginia woods since I was a kid, following in my old man's footsteps. Every fall, I'd pack up my gear and head out to my favorite spot, a quiet stretch of forest that always seemed to deliver. This year was different, though. The woods felt off somehow, quieter than usual, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I'd been tracking a nice buck for the better part of the day, following a trail that seemed to wind aimlessly through the underbrush. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I'd wandered far off my usual hunting grounds. The trees here were older, gnarled things, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. That's when I stumbled upon the cabin. It was a small, ramshackle structure, the kind of place you'd expect some old hermit to hole up in. The roof sagged dangerously, and vines crept up the weathered walls. But something about it caught my eye. Despite its dilapidated appearance, there were signs of recent activity. A pile of freshly chopped wood by the door, wisps of smoke curling from the chimney. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. "Hello," I called out. "Anybody home?" No answer, just a whisper of wind through the trees and the faint crackle of the cabin's fire. I tried the door, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it swung open with a protesting groan. The interior was dark, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through grimy windows. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. The cabin was a single room, sparsely furnished. A narrow cot huddled in one corner, a pot-bellied stove in another. A rickety table stood in the center, its surface covered in papers and what looked like hand-drawn maps. "Hello," I called again, stepping fully inside. Still no response. I should have left then, should have turned around and tried to find my way back to familiar territory. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a nagging feeling that I couldn't quite put my finger on. My eyes were drawn to a leather-bound journal sitting prominently on the table. It looked old, its cover cracked and worn. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, but as I deciphered the words, a chill ran down my spine. October 15th, it's back again. I can hear it moving in the woods at night, circling the cabin. Whatever it is, it's big. Bigger than any bear I've ever seen. And smart. Too smart. It's testing the defenses, looking for weaknesses. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. I flipped to another entry, dated just a few days ago. October 28th, I think I've figured out what it wants. It's not just hunting for food. It's playing with me, toying with its prey. Last night, I swear I heard it laugh. A sound no animal should be able to make. God help me. I don't think I'm dealing with an animal at all. The journal slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. As if in response, a branch snapped loudly just outside the cabin. I whirled around, heart pounding. Through the grimy window, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large, darting between the trees. It was gone before I could get a clear look. Panic rising in my throat, I snatched up the journal and shoved it into my pack. Whatever was going on here, I wanted no part of it. It was time to get the hell out of Dodge. I yanked open the cabin door, ready to make a run for it. But as I stepped outside, I realized with growing horror that the forest had changed. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the fading daylight. Shadows deepened, taking on strange, shifting shapes. And the silence. God, the silence. Not a bird call, not a rustle of leaves. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow up every sound. I picked a direction at random and started walking, trying to keep my pace steady despite the urge to break into a run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I knew that panic would only make things worse. I needed to stay calm, to think rationally, but rational thought became increasingly difficult as the minutes stretched on. No matter how far I walked, the scenery never seemed to change. The same gnarled trees, the same moss-covered rocks. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me lost. As darkness fell in earnest, I was forced to admit defeat. I couldn't risk wandering blindly through unfamiliar woods at night. I needed to find shelter, to regroup, and try again in the morning. With a sinking heart, I realized there was only one option. I had to go back to the cabin. Retracing my steps was easier said than done. In the gathering gloom, every tree looked the same, every path identical. I was on the verge of despair when I spotted a faint glow through the trees. Firelight from the cabin's windows. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a renewed sense of dread. If I was back at the cabin, that meant whatever the journal's author had been writing about might still be out there. I approached cautiously, every sense on high alert. The woods around me had come alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, perfectly normal forest noises. But in the context of everything that had happened, each one sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. The cabin door stood open, just as I'd left it. I paused on the threshold, straining my ears for any sound of movement inside. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, I stepped in. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the journal lying open on the floor where I dropped it. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I shut the door behind me, throwing the bowl for good measure. It wasn't much protection, but it made me feel marginally better. Now what? I was trapped in a stranger's cabin, lost in a forest that seemed determined to keep me here, with some unknown threat lurking in the darkness. And I had no one to blame but my own curiosity. I sank into the room's only chair, burying my face in my hands. Damn it, there had to be a way out of this mess. A soft thud from outside made me jerk upright. I held my breath, listening intently. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin. My hand went to my rifle, though I knew in my gut it would be useless against whatever was out there. This was no ordinary predator. The footsteps paused directly outside the door. I could hear breathing now, heavy and rhythmic. Then a new sound, one that turned my blood to ice, the slow scrape of claws against wood. It was testing the door, just like the journal had described, looking for a way in. I backed away, putting the table between myself and the entrance. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon or a barricade. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a voice spoke, if you could call it a voice. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I know you're in there," it said, the words barely recognizable through the inhuman growl. "I can smell your fear." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "You don't belong here," the voice continued. "This is my forest, my hunting ground, and you are my prey." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. Of all the ways I'd imagined this hunting trip going, being stalked by some impossible monster hadn't even made the list. "What do you want?" I managed to croak out. The thing outside chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. I want to play little hunter. I want to chase, to catch, to tear. I want to hear you scream." The door shuddered as something massive slammed against it. The hinges groaned in protest. I was out of options, out of time. As the door began to splinter, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the journal and ran for the back window. The glass shattered as I hurled myself through, shards slicing my arms and face. I hit the ground hard, the breath driven from my lungs. But terror gave me strength, and I was on my feet in an instant, plunging into the dark forest. Behind me, I heard the cabin door give way with a thunderous crash. An inhuman roar of triumph echoed through the trees, spurring me to even greater speed. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear it pursuing me, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. As I fled, clutching the mysterious journal to my chest, one thought pounded through my mind in time with my racing heart. I never should have opened that damn book. I never should have come to these godforsaken woods. And now, as the creature's howls grew closer, I feared I might never leave them. The half-eaten sandwich on my kitchen table didn't belong to me. Neither did the muddy boot prints leading up the stairs. Someone had been in my cabin, and judging by the creaking floorboards above, they were still here. I'd been looking forward to this hunting trip for months. As a software engineer trapped in the concrete jungle of Seattle, these annual escapes to my family's old cabin in the Cascade Mountains were my lifeline. A chance to disconnect, to breathe clean air, and to reconnect with a part of myself that too often got buried under deadlines and office politics. The drive up had been uneventful. 5 hours of winding mountain roads, watching the urban sprawl give way to towering pines and rugged peaks. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I'd gone through my usual arrival routine, unloading the truck, firing up the generator, checking the water pump. Everything seemed normal. The cabin looked just as I'd left it last year, a sturdy log structure that had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. It wasn't until I'd finished putting away the groceries and decided to treat myself to a cold beer that I noticed something was off. There, on the kitchen table, sat a plate with a half-eaten sandwich. A sandwich I definitely hadn't made. For a moment, I just stared at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Then other details started to jump out at me. A dirty glass in the sink, mud tracked across the floor, the faint smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. My heart began to race. Someone had been here, recently, and judging by the fresh mud, they might still be around. I set my beer down quietly, straining my ears for any sound. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual creaks and settling noises of an old cabin. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floor above. Panic surged through me. I wasn't prepared for this. My hunting rifle was still locked in its case, and the small handgun I sometimes carried was back in Seattle. I was alone, unarmed, and faced with an unknown intruder in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor. I needed to get out, to get to my truck, and drive for help. But as I turned towards the door, a floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. The footsteps above suddenly stopped. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then came the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. Adrenaline kicked in, and I frantically looked around for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. I grabbed it just as a figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He was a big man, easily 6.5 feet tall and built like a lumberjack. A scraggly beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes glinted dangerously in the fading light. Well, well, he drawled, his voice a gravelly rumble. Looks like we've got company. I raised the skillet, trying to keep my voice steady. This is private property. You need to leave. Now. The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. Now that's not very hospitable. And here I thought we mountain folk were supposed to be friendly. I'm not joking, I said, backing up slowly towards the door. Get out, or I'm calling the police. He took a step forward, and I could smell the mixture of sweat, dirt, and whiskey emanating from him. Ain't no cell service up here, city boy. And even if there was, cops would take hours to get here. It's just you and me. My back hit the door, and I fumbled for the handle, never taking my eyes off the intruder. But as my fingers closed around the knob, I heard the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. I wouldn't do that if I were you, the man said, now holding a pistol pointed squarely at my chest. Why don't you put that pan down, and we have us a little chat? My arms felt like lead as I slowly lowered the skillet. The man gestured with his gun towards one of the kitchen chairs. Have a seat. Keep those hands where I can see him. I sat, my mind racing. Who was this guy? What did he want? Was he just a desperate drifter looking for shelter, or something worse? The man pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down heavily, the gun never wavering from its aim at my torso. Now then, he said, reaching with his free hand for the half-eaten sandwich. Let's start with who you are and what you're doing in my cabin. Your cabin, I sputtered, indignation momentarily overriding my fear. This has been my family's property for 3 generations. I have the deed to prove it. He took a bite of the sandwich, chewing slowly as he regarded me with narrowed eyes. Is that so? Well, ain't that interesting? Because I've been living here for the past 6 months, and I ain't seen hide nor hair of any owners. My mind reeled. 6 months? How was that possible? I'd been up here last fall for my annual hunting trip. The cabin had been empty then. Everything just as I'd left it. That's impossible, I said. I was here less than a year ago. There was no sign anyone had been here. The man shrugged. Maybe you weren't looking hard enough. Or maybe, he leaned in, his eyes glinting dangerously. You're lying to me, and I don't much care for liars. I swallowed hard, acutely aware of the gun still trained on me. I'm not lying. My name is Michael Reeves. This cabin belonged to my grandfather. He left it to my father, who left it to me. I have all the paperwork back in Seattle. I can prove it. Seattle, huh? The man said, leaning back in his chair. Long way from home, ain't you, Mr. Reeves? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My eyes darted to the door, calculating my chances of making a run for it. As if reading my thoughts, the man's grip tightened on the gun. Don't even think about it, he growled. I may be getting on in years, but I can still put a bullet in you before you make it 2 steps. What do you want? I finally managed to ask. If it's money, I don't have much on me, but you're welcome to it. The truck too. Just Just let me go." The man studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my utter confusion, he started to laugh. It was a deep belly laugh that seemed to shake the whole cabin. "Oh, son," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "You should see your face. I ain't gonna hurt you. Hell, I ain't even gonna rob you." He set the gun down on the table and held out his hand. "Name's Frank Tolliver. I'm the caretaker your daddy hired to look after this place." I stared at him, unable to process the sudden shift. Caretaker? But my father never said anything about hiring a caretaker. Frank's bushy eyebrows rose. "He didn't tell you? Well, don't that beat all? Guess he figured you had enough on your plate, without worrying about the cabin. He hired me on last spring, after that big storm came through, and did a number on the roof. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. The repairs I'd noticed but hadn't thought much about. The fresh firewood stacked neatly outside, even the faint smell of cigarette smoke that had been lingering in the air. But why the gun? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around the situation. Why the whole intimidation act? Frank shrugged, looking slightly sheepish. "Force of habit, I suppose. Spent 30 years as a sheriff before I retired. You get used to being cautious. Plus," he added with a wink, "I figured I'd have some fun with the city slicker. No offense." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. Here I'd been, scared out of my wits, and it was all just an elaborate prank by an eccentric old man. "None taken," I said, finally allowing myself to relax. "But maybe next time lead with 'Hello, I'm the caretaker,' instead of pulling a gun?" Frank laughed again, slapping his knee. "Where's the fun in that? Tell you what, let me make it up to you. I got a fresh trout I caught this morning. How about I fry it up, and you can tell me all about what brings you up to these parts?" As the tension of the past hour drained away, I found myself nodding. That sounds great, actually. But first, I think I'm going to need another beer. A strong one." Frank grinned, getting up to rummage in the fridge. "Now you're talking my language, son. Welcome to the mountains. Trust me, after a few days up here, you'll be as ornery and suspicious as the rest of us old-timers." As I watched him move about the kitchen, whistling tunelessly and pulling out pans, I couldn't help but shake my head. It wasn't the peaceful, solitary retreat I'd been expecting. But somehow, I had a feeling this hunting trip was going to be one for the books. And next year, I decided I was definitely going to call ahead. The elk's final breath misted in the crisp mountain air. I lowered my rifle, triumphant, until a bone-chilling roar shattered the silence. My hard-won trophy was about to become someone else's meal. I'd been tracking this bull for 3 days, pushing myself to the limits of my endurance in the rugged backcountry of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. At 46, I wasn't as spry as I used to be, but the thrill of the hunt still pumped through my veins like nothing else. This elk was to be the crowning achievement of my hunting career, a massive 6x6 rack that would be the envy of every sportsman I knew. The pre-dawn darkness was just starting to give way to the first pale light of morning when I spotted him. He was grazing in a small meadow, partially obscured by a stand of aspens. My heart raced as I raised my binoculars. Even at this distance, I could see he was every bit as magnificent as I'd hoped. Slowly, carefully, I began to close the distance. Every step was calculated, my boots finding purchase on the dew-slick grass with practiced ease. The wind was in my favor, carrying my scent away from the unsuspecting elk. At 200 yards, I set up for the shot. The familiar weight of my .30-06 settled against my shoulder as I peered through the scope. The crosshairs settled just behind the elk's front shoulder. I took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The report of the rifle echoed off the surrounding peaks. The bull staggered, took 2 halting steps, and collapsed. Clean kill. Exhilaration surged through me as I approached my prize. Up close, he was even more impressive. The rack would easily score over 350 inches, a true monster by any standard. I set my rifle down and pulled out my camera, eager to document my triumph before beginning the arduous task of field dressing. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera's shutter button. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound. There, not 30 yards away, stood the largest grizzly bear I had ever seen. Time seemed to stop as we locked eyes. The bear's gaze held an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just a dumb animal. This was an apex predator, weighing my threat level with cold calculation. My mind raced through everything I knew about bear encounters. Make yourself look big. Make noise. Back away slowly. But as the grizzly took a lumbering step forward, all that knowledge fled, replaced by primal terror. My rifle. I needed my rifle. But in my excitement over the elk, I'd set it down several feet away, propped against a fallen log. Might as well have been a mile. The bear roared again, a sound so deep and powerful I felt it in my chest. It was a clear message. This elk is mine. Back off. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be suicide. Instead, I began to inch backwards, my eyes never leaving the massive predator. "Easy, big fella," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the mountain air. "No need for trouble. I'm just gonna mosey on out of here, and you can have your breakfast in peace." The grizzly huffed, steam billowing from its nostrils in the cool morning air. It took another step forward, massive paws easily spanning the distance. I could see its muscles rippling beneath its shaggy coat, coiled and ready to charge. My back hit a tree trunk, and I realized with growing horror that I'd backed myself into a corner. To my left was a steep embankment, too treacherous to attempt in my panic. To my right, the bear stood between me and any hope of escape. Time slowed to a crawl as the grizzly and I faced off. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see every detail of the bear's face, the scars crisscrossing its muzzle, the yellow teeth bared in a snarl, the small eyes glinting with predatory focus. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity how small and insignificant I truly was. All my skill as a hunter, all my fancy gear and years of experience, meant nothing in the face of nature's raw power. I was no longer the predator. I was prey. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over me at easily 9 feet tall. A whimper escaped my throat as I pressed myself against a tree, feeling the rough bark dig into my back through my jacket. This was it. This was how I was going to die. Torn apart by a grizzly in the middle of nowhere, my body never to be found. I thought of my wife, my kids, how they'd wonder what had happened to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. A lifetime of hunting, only to end up as Corey myself. As the bear's front paws began to descend, I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But instead of crushing weight and tearing claws, I heard a sharp crack, followed by a pained bellow. My eyes flew open to see the grizzly stumbling backwards, shaking its head in confusion. A pine cone lay on the ground between us, apparently having fallen from the tree above at just the right moment to strike the bear squarely on the snout. It was the opening I needed. Without conscious thought, I lunged for my rifle. My hands closed around the familiar stock, just as the bear recovered from its momentary disorientation. Time seemed to stretch as I brought the rifle up, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The bear charged, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. I had one shot, one chance. The roar of the rifle was deafening at such close range. I was dimly aware of a searing pain in my shoulder as the recoil slammed the butt of the gun back into me. But my eyes were locked on the grizzly. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd missed. The bear was still coming, all teeth and claws and unstoppable fury. Then, just feet from where I stood, it stumbled. The massive head dipped, paws tangling as it lost coordination. With a final, whuffing exhale, The grizzly crashed to the ground. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. I stood there, rifle still raised, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. Slowly, hesitantly, I lowered the gun. The bear lay motionless, steam rising from its body in the cool morning air. My shot had found its mark, entering just behind the front shoulder and piercing the heart. A textbook kill, executed in the most desperate of circumstances. As the adrenaline began to fade, I became aware of a warm wetness on my face. Reaching up, my fingers came away red. In its final lunge, the bear's claws had grazed my cheek, leaving shallow but bloody furrows. I sank to my knees, the enormity of what had just happened crashing over me. I was alive, by all rights. I should be dead, nothing more than scraps of meat and torn clothing. But here I was, still breathing, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm of survival. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the fallen grizzly. It was even more massive in depth, a mountain of muscle and fur. Despite the lingering fear, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was a creature of raw power, a force of nature in its own right, and I had bested it, if only by the skin of my teeth and a generous helping of luck. Eventually, I forced myself to stand on shaky legs. I had work to do, 2 enormous animals to field dress, meat to pack out, authorities to notify about the bear. But as I reached for my knife, I paused. The elk that had started this whole ordeal lay forgotten, several yards away. The trophy rack that had seemed so important just minutes ago now felt hollow, meaningless. I had come into these mountains seeking glory, a conquest to brag about to my hunting buddies. Instead, I've been given a stark reminder of my own mortality and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. I looked out over the mountains, painted gold by the now-risen sun. For the first time, I saw them not as a playground for my hunting pursuits, but as a complex, interconnected ecosystem where every creature, from the lowliest vole to the mightiest grizzly, played its part. With a deep breath, I made a decision. I would take only what meat I could carry for my own needs. The rest, both elk and bear, would remain here, returning to the land that had birthed them. It felt right, a way to honor the life and death struggle that had played out in this remote meadow. As I began the long hike back to civilization, my pack heavy with meat and my mind heavier with newfound respect, I knew one thing for certain. I would never look at hunting or the wilderness the same way again.